Shana Tova, Shana Tova, Shana Tova. Our story is who we are. And my story is intertwined with the story of my kippah. And so this morning I've got 3 kippah moments, some lessons from the field of neurology, and then one story. As a young adult, before I went to rabbinical school, I wore my kippah most of the time, but not all the time. Sometimes I wanted my kippah on my head, and sometimes I didn't. Sometimes I wanted to publicly express my Jewish identity, and sometimes I just wanted to blend in and be a regular guy. So kippah moment number 1. One night in Los Angeles, before I decided that I wanted to become a rabbi, I was going out with some friends to a jazz club, and I walked toward the club with my kippah on my head, and I was on the fence. Should I wear my kippah? Should I not wear my kippah? Ultimately, I decided to take my kippah off. It wasn't a big deal. I just wanted to enjoy a night out without making a public religious statement. So I put my kippah in my pocket. As I got closer to the club, I could hear the cool jazz muffled through the door. I swung the door open and the music came alive. I walked inside with my kippah in my pocket. The very first person I saw standing there, right in front of me, was wearing a gorgeous, gigantic white turban on his head. He had a beautifully trimmed beard, his white turban wrapped up tight in an intricate design that seemed to twist and turn up to the very heavens. And slowly, I reached back into my pocket and put my kippah back on my head and never again took it off in public. If this guy could wear his phenomenal, gigantic turban, then certainly I could wear my little kippah on my head. So this moment became part of the story of my life. Our story is who we are. And that moment changed the narrative of my life and launched me toward the rabbinate. The trajectory of my narrative shifted. My story became about a young man experiencing a Jewish renewal. I wanted to deepen my Jewish learning, expand my Jewish identity, invite others to do the same. I wanted to be a Jewish leader, part of the colorful tapestry that is the United States of America. I wanted to wear my kippah like a freedom flag of Jewish pride. And that became my story. That kippah moment, number 1. Neurologists teach us that our story is the way our minds create meaning. We connect the dots of our life experiences so that we perceive ourselves as unique individuals with a cohesive story across time. And it's a neurological process. Experiences create neural pathways from the hippocampus to the prefrontal cortex and other parts of the brain. And these neural pathways integrate our personal experiences into our self-identity, right? The experiences integrate into the brain and create our self-identity. In other words, we are a collection of moments arranged in a cohesive narrative. Does that make sense? We are a collection of moments arranged in a cohesive narrative. We are stories. Our stories are who we are. And that kippah moment, I'm sure, shaped one of my neural pathways. And that moment reconnected the dots of my experience of my life and launched me toward the rabbinate and secured the kippah on top of my head. That's right. Our story is who we are. Are you with me so far? Okay. It's a little neurology, but not a lot. In the past, even when I chose to take my kippah off, I never took it off out of fear. I felt safe to wear my kippah everywhere I've lived. Southfield, Michigan to Chicago, Los Angeles to St. Louis, and right here in Texas. I was never afraid to publicize my Jewish identity. And every place I went, in jazz clubs, in restaurants, in ballparks, and stadiums, and I also felt comfortable wearing my kippah in airports. Kippah moment number 2. I arrived at Bush Intercontinental Airport a few months after October 7th with my kippah on my head. I was making my way through a crowded terminal to catch a flight to Chicago. The war in Israel was raging. Hamas terrorists were hiding in their tunnels. Rockets were falling on Israel. Israel was bombing Gaza. The college campuses were raging with protests. Anti-Semitic incidents were up 400%. And here I was in a crowded airport filled with strangers. I looked up at a television monitor, and CNN was showing close-ups of Palestinian bodies crushed under the rubble. I was in the airport with the kippah on my head, and suddenly I felt unsafe. I swung my backpack off my shoulders, reached inside, and found my blue Detroit Tigers baseball cap, and I hid my kippah under my hat. For the first time in my life, out of fear, I hid my kippah under my hat. So that's kippah moment number 2. And neuroscientists also teach that our self-identity isn't static. Neuroscience has a name for when a moment becomes pivotal in our shifting identity. They call that neuroplasticity. When a transformative moment arrives, our brains change, our self-identity adapts. These pivotal experiences continually shape our neural connections. Our experiences continually shape our identity. And here I was with my kippah under my hat, at risk of losing my Jewish pride out of fear of anti-Semitism. My niece, Hadassah, lives in Israel in the West Bank, the territories. From time to time, Vicky and I get panicky WhatsApp messages from her imploring us to make Aliyah because she's so worried about anti-Semitism in America. Dossie lives in the West Bank. Even after October 7th, she's more worried about us living in America than she is about herself living in the West Bank. She'd rather deal with rocket attacks and gunfire than live with anti-Semitism in America. So why is that? Why does she feel safe there? And meanwhile, I'm taking off my kippah here. Because Dossie lives in Israel, and I live in the diaspora. Our story is who we are. And neurologists also teach that our stories are influenced by the stories we inherit from our ancestors. The scientific term for it is transgenerational epigenetics. Transgenerational, identity gets passed down from generation to generation. Epigenetics is the study how our ancestors' stories can affect the way our genes express themselves. Turns out, we're a combination of our own story and the story of our ancestors. And so when I took off my kippah at the airport, I felt the weight of the anti-Semitism that our ancestors must have felt in their diaspora. As I hid my kippah under my hat, I finally understood why my niece Dossie was so worried about us in the diaspora. I subconsciously felt that transgenerational fear of our parents, our grandparents, our great-grandparents who lived their lives in the diaspora. I've been living here in America and teaching about Israel as if America and Israel were basically equivalent, right? The two largest Jewish communities in the world, America and Israel, both flourishing in their own unique ways. But Dossie was right. The reality is that she lives in the Jewish state and I live in the diaspora. She feels safe in Israel because she has a country. She feels safe in Israel because she has an army. Dossie was born in Israel. Her story is Israel's story. She inherited the story of Israel from her parents, who made Aliyah before she was born. October 7th was a catastrophic breach in Israel's border, but she is 100% certain that Israel will prevail. 100% certain that Israel will protect her. And Israel will protect all of her citizens, and Am Yisrael Chai. Meanwhile, I hid my kippah under my hat. and I felt the vulnerability of Jewish life in the diaspora. My ancestral memory is connected to our diaspora story of discrimination and persecution. Our ancestors, in their diaspora, clawed their way to America, bloodied and beaten. Our ancestors were the poor and huddled masses. It's true we've been enjoying decades of American Jewish success, but in the larger context of the Jewish diaspora, we're a blip on the radar screen, a brief moment in time. We're enjoying the freedoms of America so much that sometimes we forget what it really means for us to be living in a diaspora. And on October 7th, we were all witness to the massacre and the vulnerability, and we're all experiencing the aftermath of anti-Semitism. We sensed the darkness, and it reminded us that we're not beyond our transgenerational diaspora trauma. I felt the weight of that trauma, and I hid my kippah under my hat. Our story, along with our ancestors' story, is who we are. Neurologists also teach, luckily, that we have the ability to proactively reshape our neural pathways. In the 1980s, a field of therapy was created called narrative therapy. Narrative therapy was created to help us reshape problematic narratives into more productive narratives. Typically, our brain connects the dots of our experiences for us, like a default. However, neurologists and psychologists agree that we can have some degree of input into the way our pathways get shaped. We have some control over our self-identity. Here's an example. When Hirsch Goldberg Polin was found murdered, I was in Los Angeles. I watched the funeral live stream at 6 a.m. and stood witness as John and Rachel eulogized their only son, Hirsch. I cried as they processed and contextualized their grief. And what happened? John told Hirsch's story, because stories are who we are. John told Hirsch's story and gave shape and meaning and purpose to Hirsch's life. When Hirsch was 3, they would walk hand in hand, and Hirsch would ask deep questions beyond his years. When Hirsch was 6, he memorized dates and facts about every U.S. president. When he was 7, he told the story. When he was 12, he became an independent thinker. When he was 13, he became a social activist. When he was a teenager, he was a critical thinker and an open mind and a sensitive heart. John told Hirsch's story, and he prayed that Hirsch's story would become a revolution. John spoke to Hirsch's soul and said, maybe, just maybe, your death is the fuel that will bring home the remaining 101 hostages. Odlo avda tikvatenu. We still have hope. And then Rachel recontextualized Hirsch's story from a barbaric murder into a sense of gratitude for his life. It was such a powerful, overwhelming exhibit of how to proactively change a narrative from barbarism to hope through the power of story. John and Rachel must have been angry. They were the very definition of victims of Hamas, victims of failed attempts at negotiations. But they didn't focus on their anger and hate and revenge. Instead, they told Hirsch's story and began a process of rewiring all of our neural pathways, from victimhood to inspiration, from terror to hope. Keep a moment number 3. After the funeral, I left for LAX at 7 a.m., and I was making my way through the crowded airport to catch a flight to New York. And once again, I was surrounded in an airport by strangers with the kippah on my head. And suddenly, I felt that familiar feeling of vulnerability. But instead of reaching for my tiger's cap, I left my kippah on my head for all to see. I felt vulnerable, but I acted resilient. John and Rachel inspired me to proactively reshape my story. John and Rachel taught me through the power of the telling of Hirsch's story how to rewire my neurological pathways towards faith and towards strength and resilience. Our stories are who we are. Stories shape our identity, and the story left the kippah on my head for all to see. One more story. A few months after October 7th, I met an Israeli right here in the social hall. Short hair, tall, chiseled jaw, 5 o'clock shadow, muscles, Israeli. He was born in Israel and moved to Houston, and a few years ago he served in an elite army unit, completed his service, and moved to America. He was here in Houston when he heard about October 7th. He got in his car, drove to the airport, and caught the first flight to Israel to join his elite army unit who were already in Gaza. He fought in Gaza, and now he was back. I told him my theory that October 7th reminded us of our vulnerability here and in Israel. And he said, absolutely not. He said that the story of October 7th is not about vulnerability. The story of October 7th is about strength, the strength of a country unifying against a common enemy. It's a story about resilience and courage. October 7th is a story about duty and honor and country. And I walked away thinking, well, I guess we just have different stories. That's okay. It took me a while, but I finally got there. He was right. Israel's story is our story. Yes, our ancestry is from the diaspora, but now we have an additional source of influence on our narrative. I thought to myself, what if my story isn't only connected to the story of the diaspora? What if my story is also connected to the story of Israel? Our ancestors suffered through life in the diaspora, but they didn't have a sovereign state of Israel. Israel is in our hands. Medinat Yisrael biyadenu. And now I realize that this Israeli commando, this real-life superhero who I met in the social hall, is part of my story. And we can draw courage from his courage. Now I realize that my little niece, Dasi, is part of my story, and we can draw confidence from her confidence. It's time that we integrate the narrative of the state of Israel into our own American Jewish narrative. Let's connect our story to the stories of those who walked the ancient land of Israel and the modern state of Israel. Israel is also part of our DNA. Let's integrate the leadership of Abraham, the strength of King David, the wisdom of Solomon, the fortitude of Herzl, the assuredness of Ben-Gurion, the toughness of Golda Meir. We are the children of Israel. And let's remember that neuroplasticity is not only a default. We can choose to expand our American Jewish story to include the state of Israel. We can choose to connect our identity with the state of Israel. Our story is who we are, and we have the power to shape our story in 3 words: Am Yisrael Chai. The Jewish people will live, and we will thrive in Israel and in the American Jewish diaspora. That's our story. Ribono shel olam, source of all, thank you for creating our beautiful and complex minds. Thank you for guiding our experiences that are the narrative of our story. As we stand before you today, help us to embrace our story and give us the wisdom to reframe and reshape our story. And in that way, we will transform our vulnerability into strength. We will transform our victimhood into resilience, transform our splintering into unity, our despair into hope, our darkness into light, and our tragedy into blessing. And may we all follow John and Rachel's lead, and may even Hirsch's memory become a blessing for us all. And together we say, Amen. Od Avinu Chai. Od Avinu Chai. Od Avinu, Od Avinu, Od Avinu Chai. Od Avinu Chai. Od Avinu Chai. Od Avinu, Od Avinu, Od Avinu Chai. Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael 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 Chai. Od Avinu Chai, Chai. Od Avinu Chai, Chai. Od Avinu, Od Avinu, Od Avinu Chai. Od Avinu Chai, Chai. Od Avinu Chai. Od Avinu, Od Avinu, Od Avinu Chai. Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael 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 Chai. Od Avinu Chai. Od Avinu Chai. Od Avinu, Od Avinu, Od Avinu Chai. Shana Tova, Shana Tova.